Uh, Tonight we have Natalie Warren, and she is going to be talking about her trip as one of the first two women to paddle from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay, 2,000 miles. Um, since doing that, she's canoed the length of the Mississippi River and won first place in the Yukon River Quest in the women's voyageur division, paddling 450 miles in 53 hours, which is pretty darn impressive. Natalie has written a book about her adventure, the remarkable 85-day journey of the first two women to canoe the 2,000-mile route from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. And she's also been a contributing writer to various outdoors publications, has worked with the Bancroft Arnesen Explore, St. Croix River Association, and River Management Society, and she started a nonprofit to present urban rivers as natural dynamic classrooms for youth. She's currently a PhD student in the Communication Studies Department at the University of Minnesota, studying environmental communication. And she lives in Minneapolis with her husband, daughter, and dog. So I'm excited to hear about her adventure, and take it away, Natalie.
All right, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and talk with all of you. So my name is Natalie Warren. Thank you so much, Fran, for the introduction and for inviting me here today. In 2011, a decade ago, I was one of the first two women to paddle over 2,000 miles from Minneapolis, St. Paul, to Hudson Bay. And we were inspired by Eric Sevareid's route from his book, Canoeing with the Cree. Eric Sevareid and Walter Port did this route in 1930. So talk about outdoor gear. They didn't even have sleeping bags on their trip. There was no down jacket situation. If you haven't read Canoeing with the Cree, it's an absolutely wonderful, inspiring story, and I highly recommend it. So Anne and I found out that no two women had done this route, and we decided to tackle that. So since then, I have, like Fran was saying, paddled the length of the Mississippi River, done a lot of canoe racing. I've paddled over 7,000 miles in a canoe, and I have written a book published by the University of Minnesota Press that came out this February called Hudson Bay Bound, Two Women, One Dog, 2,000 Miles to the Arctic. And you can get that anywhere, but I highly recommend getting it from a local bookstore, especially Majors and Quinn in Minneapolis currently has signed copies. I did not grow up doing outdoor things. I am from Miami, Florida, and I went to high school in the concrete jungle of downtown Miami for saxophone performance at a very small art school. And when I was 15, I realized that I didn't want to be a professional musician when I grew up, and I desperately needed to find other things to do. And so my friend told me about this wilderness camp called YMCA Camp Minogen up on the Gunflint Trail, and told me about a magical place called the Boundary Waters. Now, growing up in Miami, I had never been to the Midwest before. It was just sort of that gray blob in the middle of the country that I hadn't thought much about. But as the youngest of three children, I stampeded home that day and declared to my mother that I would be going to Minnesota, of all places, to go canoeing. I had never been canoeing. I'd never been overnight camping. And my first trip was a 2-week Boundary Waters trip through Minogen. I was completely out of my element. I woke everyone up one night because I heard wolves howling, and I actually thought we were going to be eaten alive. And they informed me that it actually was the call of the loon. So I'd never heard a loon before. My mom wrote me a letter, and I opened it on trail, and it said, "I hope you're enjoying the beautiful mountains of Minnesota." So no one knew where I was or where I went off to every summer, but I continued to go on trips through Minogen, which culminated in, we went on a 30-day trip in Ontario in Wabakimi Provincial Park, where I first started paddling whitewater, and then a 50-day canoe trip in Nunavut, Canada on the Kazan, Coonwalk, Arctic Inuit Heritage Rivers, paddling lots of whitewater, watching thousands of migrating caribou in the remote tundra, watching musk oxen graze by the river. But more important than all of that on that trip was the woman who was assigned to be my paddling partner. This is Anne Rayho. Unlike me, Anne grew up in Minnesota. She grew up exploring the woods, and she was an outdoors woman through and through. I admired her so much and wanted to be her in many ways when we met. So we were assigned paddling partners, and we were making small conversation on the first day. And she said, well, where are you going to school in the fall? And I said, I'm going to St. Olaf College. And she said, no way, me too. And we ended up in the same freshman dorm. What this meant was that we had 4 years together to plot. Whenever life was hard, when we're dealing with relationships or death or school, all of these things, we would end up in each other's dorm rooms, going over maps and talking about where are we going to go next. So 2011 rolls around, our senior year, and we are frantically applying for jobs, trying to enter, quote unquote, the real world all of a sudden. And the economy was still recovering from the 2008 recession. No one was hearing back from potential employers. And at a certain point, we just sort of, felt hopeless. And I remember the day that Anne came into my doorway and she was holding the book, Canoeing with the Cree. And she chucked it at me from across the room. And she said, read this, I think we should do it. And then she disappeared. And that night, instead of writing a paper, I read the book from cover to cover. And I went to her the next day and I said, okay, let's do it. So we had 3 months to plan our trip to Hudson Bay. We didn't have any money and we didn't have a canoe. These are very important things when you're planning a 90-day canoe trip. But the community came out of the woodworks and we got all of our gear and all of our food sponsored, and we raised enough money to essentially cover the costs of our trip, like our $2,000 45-minute float plane to get back after we got to York Factory on Hudson Bay. I was really nervous to do this trip. I did not grow up with female role models like Anne Bancroft. I did not see any sort of path in front of me for something that had been done before like this. And so it felt very risky, especially within my social and cultural circles back in Miami. I remember my mom was extremely concerned, and I called her from Mankato to check in, and she was so confused how I could possibly be calling her from this wilderness trip I was taking for 3 months. But Anne and I were so privileged to be the first 2 women to do this route. And we hoped, and I especially hope now through my book, that this book and this story will get into the hands and hearts of young women and inspire them to do something different, to provide a different narrative to their life. So this is our route, Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. I'll provide an overview and then I'll go through in a little bit more detail some stories and things we learned along the way. So we left from Fort Snelling State Park and we paddled upstream on the Minnesota River for the first 330 miles. We paddled upstream during a flood, which I will talk a little bit more about, but you can see here the check mark of the Minnesota River. We actually had to paddle southwest before we started heading north. And then we went through a lake section and then paddled the Bois de Sioux River, which is a very channelized river that meets up with the Ottertail River in Wahpeton and becomes the Red River of the North, which is the border between Minnesota and the Dakotas, and took us into Canada through Winnipeg and dumped us into Lake Winnipeg, the 11th largest lake in the world. We went 280 miles up the east shore of Lake Winnipeg. And then we had a small stint on the Nelson River to the Etchemamish Creek, and that met up with the Hayes River out to York Factory on Hudson Bay. So this is the sort of Arctic whitewater river at the end here. So like I mentioned, we left during a flood. The 2011 flood, we left on June 2nd. The Department of Natural Resources actually contacted us and told us that we shouldn't be paddling during flood stage, but we decided to give it a try. And this is the first moment that we pushed off into the current. We were nervous that we would get sideswept downstream and seriously considered paddling the Mississippi River instead. But that river was waiting for me for another adventure. You can see we are crawling upstream at a steady 1.5 miles per hour for 330 miles. Before we left on the Minnesota River, people told us the Minnesota River is the river of chocolate milk. It is a polluted agricultural river. It's too bad you have to paddle it as a part of this route. So we had very low expectations going into this section of our expedition. But on the first day of our trip, we were paddling through a national wildlife refuge. an otter came and swam by our canoe to wish us luck on our way. And we found it to be a really beautiful river, and we felt like we had it to ourselves. That being said, the Minnesota River is a polluted agricultural river. You can still paddle it and it is still beautiful, but it does have a lot of issues. I studied environmental studies and environmental policy in college, and so I felt like I knew a lot about what the world should look like from reading and talking about it in a silo. But going out into the world and actually paddling through the Corn Belt taught me that things like buffer zones, the vegetation in between the farmland and the water that helps filter out chemicals from getting into the river, are essentially non-existent, especially during a flood. We saw this very, very common sight, cornfields going directly up to the river. And what this means is that the chemicals we use on these larger scale farms, like nitrogen and phosphorus, they're flowing directly into the Minnesota River, that flows into the Mississippi River, that flows into the Gulf of Mexico and contributes to the dead zone, an area where algal blooms are caused by this excess nitrogen and aquatic life is not able to live, which hurts more than just the aquatic life, but also the economy down there. We felt really frustrated with these scenes that we came across on the water, but because the river was flooded, we actually had to knock on farmers' doors and ask if we could camp on drier land on their property. This usually turned into them inviting us over for dinner, and before you know it, us young, fresh out of college liberals are sitting across the table from people who have really different perspectives and experiences with the land. And we were able to have really candid conversations, express our frustrations with what we were seeing on the river, and hear their stories of getting paid by yield, having to grow as much as possible to be able to even cover their bills and support their families, which many of them their children are not coming back to take over the farms. You can imagine my further surprise to find out that this corn and the soybeans that we grow on the Minnesota River and on the Red River, so much of it does not actually provide food directly for people. It goes to ethanol, it goes to feed for cows who are not evolved to even consume corn. So then enter the pharmaceutical companies. And so we learned more about these systems and started to question and envision different ways of living in the world that doesn't directly pollute our water resources. We came across this quite a bit. So it is common practice today in conventional agriculture to tile fields. What this means is this area that used to be mostly prairie, where the rain would fall and sink into the ground and recharge the groundwater system. Now, when the rain falls, it gets shuttled directly out to the river. And now the Minnesota River holds more water than it has in recent history. What that means is that it cuts the banks, it erodes the soil, and increases sediment levels within the river that again flow downstream, harming communities elsewhere. Anne and I were able to experience the river during a flood. When we paddled close to shore to be out of the stronger current, we would hear the forest cracking and cracking until the roots of the trees became so loose that trees would fall into the river and just start floating downstream. We paddled by energy plants, these places hidden away on rivers that we don't often see, that impact our daily life, the flip of a light switch or the turn of the faucet. We started to see a little bit more of the underbelly of society and its inner workings. In this scenario, we could paddle by an energy plant and feel the temperature of the water after the discharge, feel how much warmer it was, and start to think about how that impacts the aquatic life and the ecosystems there. We came across dams that were not just annoying for us as paddlers to portage around, and oftentimes there were not even paths around them, but also they segment the rivers and they don't allow aquatic life to flow freely for long stretches of river, which they absolutely need. This dam, the Minnesota Falls, was actually removed. And if you're interested in paddling the Minnesota River, it now has over 200 miles of free flowing water from Granite Falls to Minneapolis. And this is now a Class 3 rapid set. So when we were paddling up to the Granite Falls Dam, the current was extremely strong and it was very difficult to move forward. So Anne and I were paddling as hard as we could, and I look over and I see a tree trunk. and the tree trunk wasn't moving. So we weren't moving, and we were stuck on this Minnesota River treadmill. And so I said, in between heavy breaths, and why don't we just take out and portage or carry our gear to the other side of the dam and put back in where the current isn't as strong? Just as we agreed to do this, two photographers from the local paper jumped out of the bushes and started taking pictures of us and saying, "You can do it. You can paddle all the way to the dam." So what ensued after that was about a 45-minute, less than half a mile paddle in which the community came to the riverbank to cheer us on. And we finally made it to the takeout at the dam. And the mayor was there to greet us. And he said, "Wow, I've never even seen two guys do that before." And I remember thinking, why the heck would anyone do that? We continued through a lake section and then the Little Minnesota River, and that connected us with the Bois de Sioux River, which is heavily channelized by the Army Corps. When Eric Sevareid did this route, it was still a natural flowing river. So it was very different than what we had read about in Canoeing with the Cree. We finally got to the headwaters of the Red River of the North. We were flowing downstream after 3 weeks of paddling upstream during a flood. At this point, we were paddling 50 to 60 miles a day compared to our 12 to 15 miles a day paddling the Minnesota. We came across this monument on the river. It's 5 empty tractor seats to represent the disappearance of the family farm. So we continued to learn about the land and the impacts of agriculture in this area of the United States. And what we found is we would go into towns and people would show us around and they would say, "This place used to be really cool." With the advancement in technology and agriculture, you really just need 1, maybe 2 people to farm thousands of acres of land, and they don't even have to live on that property. So there's a decreasing populations in a lot of these communities, and the economy reliant solely on agriculture is actually hurting this sort of vibrant small town America. And so Anne and I would often muse at this idea of we're paddling town to town, pretty good distances, day paddles in between each town. What would it look like to have a recreational economy, to diversify that, to bring more people to these areas, to have bed and breakfasts and diners and things that people can do to bike, hike, paddle, and canoe, all focused around strong community and clean water. We saw a lot of dilapidated buildings, but I don't want you to think that the Red River is just this ghost town for paddlers. Really, we met a lot of wonderful people that took us in. This is a group of people from the International Water Institute in Climax, Minnesota. They threw a barbecue for us. And everyone at this barbecue kept telling us the same story about a woman in the neighboring town of Fertile who was murdered in their community. And the next morning, the newspaper title was "Fertile Woman Dies in Climax." Just making sure you're still paying attention. So we had to cross the Red River and we had to cross the border into Canada on the Red River. Anne is much better at logistics than I am. And so she had reached out already to the border station, and they said they would meet us by the river so that we wouldn't have to portage our gear a mile off of the water just to check in and cross the border. That being said, we didn't really know what to expect. So we left on the water like any other day. And when we turned the corner, we saw a bridge with 2 huge black SUVs on top. And when they saw us, they turned their sirens on and came down to the riverbank. 6 border agents came out of these vehicles and watched us approach them. The Red River is so muddy, especially during a flood. Anne and I were caked in mud. Our canoe was caked in mud, and it was impossible to simply paddle to shore and get out on solid ground. So they watched this sort of dramatic play of us trying to reach dry land, our canoe getting stuck in the mud. We step out and do the quick steps so that we don't sink in the mud. And finally, we get over to where they are, and they look at us and they look at our canoe and they look at their shiny boots and they think, "We're not going to go over there. Why don't you go get your gun?" We brought a gun with us for extra protection in polar bear country, which really just means it made our moms feel a little bit better about our protection in polar bear country. And they took Anne to sign a waiver at the border station. Meanwhile, I was on shore with these three agents, and I was, I have fairly good social skills. I was trying to make conversation, but everything was just dead end, dead end. And I thought, where the heck is Anne? Well, it's a hot July summer day. And Anne, when she gets nervous, she turns bright red. And so she was filling out this waiver for our gun and started, turned bright red, got really sweaty. They accused her for acting suspiciously and had to take her in for a whole new series of questions. But finally, she came back and we took off into Canada. Canada for us means poutine. When you're burning thousands of calories a day, all you want to eat is French fries covered in gravy and cheese curds. And so we stopped in the first town that we passed, and we walked up to a dive bar in our muck boots, and we opened the door and we looked in and said, "Do you have poutine?" And the guy at the bar just stopped and looked at us and said very seriously, "We have the best poutine in Manitoba." And so we carbo loaded, and the danger of paddling with just two people is that we said, hey, you know what? We only have 100 miles left to go on the river until we get to Winnipeg. And we know there are no more big obstacles in the way. Anne's parents were meeting us in Winnipeg. We knew we were going to be able to sleep in a bed at a hotel the next day. So we thought, why not paddle 100 miles straight overnight? So we took off after carbo loading and began our overnight journey on the Red River. So this is around 10:30 p.m. And this is the moon around 1 a.m. It was a full moon and it was creating shadows in our canoe. And to stay awake, we kept singing our repertoire of music, and we were singing Cat Stevens' Moon Shadow, but we only knew one verse. So we would just repeat it over and over and over until you start to go crazy and have to do something else. We really liked the idea that as we're paddling through the suburbs of Winnipeg in the summer, people had their windows open and they could hear river sirens going through the night. Light started to show in the sky just before 5 a.m. and we watched this beautiful sunrise. At this point, we calculated we're paddling 5-6 miles an hour. We haven't slept in 24 hours, but we know we'll get to Winnipeg at 7 a.m. But 7 a.m. rolls around and we come across this sign on the riverbank that just says danger really big, and it's pointed toward the river and nobody is around. So I'm a little bit laissez-faire. I'm like, what an interesting sign. We'll keep going. And Anne needed to figure this out. So we pulled over and I overheard Anne calling authority figures in Winnipeg asking, we're paddling the Red River. There's this large danger sign, and no one knew what she was talking about. So she came back to the canoe defeated, and we're exhausted. We're like, we'll just keep on going. We're almost there. But we turn the corner, and in front of us now is this massive dam with rushing white water at the bottom and a control tower at top. And they had opened up the floodgates around Winnipeg, which became difficult for us to navigate directly into the city. What this meant for us is that after not sleeping for a very long time, we now had to portage across this dam. And of course, you can imagine paddlers are always at the table during planning conversations for large infrastructure. And so of course, there's a portage path around it. Nope, we went to one side. It was nothing but all boulders all the way up to the road. And we decided to check out the other side. So we used one of our whitewater techniques where you paddle against the current at a 45-degree angle, and it actually just pushes you to the other side of the river. It's called forward ferrying. And on the other side of the river, it was the same boulders up to a road, same thing on the way down. So it took us about 3 hours to portage over this dam. And the very last time we were crossing the street, the guy came out of the control tower and he was holding a cup of coffee and looking very relaxed, which is sort of the last person you want to see when you're frustrated and tired. And he's like, where are y'all going? I said, well, we're paddling to Hudson Bay, and kept walking. And then I saw Anne think, stop, turn around and go, did you put that sign out there? And just cracks and starts yelling at this guy about how he has to put a number on it while I'm dragging her down the other side of the dam saying, thank you, have a nice day. So we finally got to Winnipeg, and this is near where the Assiniboine River flows into the Red River. Again, peak record flood stage. A lot of the touristy areas by the river in Winnipeg were completely shut down due to the flood. We were able to restock on food, and I convinced Anne over, some slight manipulation over the course of 2 weeks that we needed to see the premiere of Harry Potter before we did not see it for another month and a half. And so we were the smelliest people at the movie theater. And then we departed onto the next leg of our journey, Lake Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg is the 11th largest lake in the world in terms of surface area. It is a very shallow lake, and people warned us that when the wind picks up and when the weather picks up, the waves respond very quickly. And so you can go from safe paddling conditions to very dangerous conditions, the flip of a coin. But when we got to Lake Winnipeg, it was as smooth as glass. You couldn't even see where the water met the sky. And that's what it was like for us for the first 2 or 3 days that we were paddling the lake. So we were like, what's everyone talking about? Well, we would soon find out. We were entering a more rugged wilderness at this point. We started to encounter wildlife. We could watch the sun sink into itself every night with just this beautiful horizon line to the west of us. One night we were doing a night paddle because the wind isn't as strong at night, but something felt a little bit off. We got a vibe that we shouldn't be on the water. So we pulled over, and just then a huge lightning storm came through. The sky turned orange and lightning was striking all across this massive lake in front of us. And we were thankful that we had pulled over. As we were falling asleep that night, I was about to shut my eyes and I look up and I see 2 huge black bear claws pushing down at the top of our tent right above me. And so I jump to the other side of the tent and I wake Anne up and I'm like, Anne, there's a bear, get the foghorn. Anne's mom had prepared us in every way possible, and that included bringing a tiny foghorn for the sole purpose of scaring away black bears. And so we thought this was sort of a funny joke that she had given it to us, but here we were in the middle of the night, rummaging around through all of our things, desperately looking for this tiny foghorn. And we find it, and Anne goes to push it, and it just goes, which is fine. It's a black bear, right? You got out of the tent at the same time. We looked really big. We made big sounds, and it ran into the woods. That night, the weather got worse. The corners of our tent started lifting, and the wind got stronger and stronger. So we actually had to disassemble our tent and follow that black bear in the woods. And we sat on our life jackets in lightning position for several hours. The next day, the wind was still too strong to paddle, and so we were making a leisurely breakfast, and Anne grabs the foghorn and she's like, I can't believe this thing didn't work last night, and she pushes it right next to my face and it goes, bah! Little too late. We, at this section of our trip, would start to see huge storm systems coming our way, and we would just paddle toward them until they got close enough where we would pull over and wait them out. We were windbound a total of 7 days on Lake Winnipeg. It took us 18 days to finish the lake. And 3 of those days were all in a row. We pulled over and we set up camp. We were making breakfast. And as we're eating, a snake comes by. And I might have overreacted a little bit, but we scare it away. And then another snake comes by. And then another snake comes by. And we look in the driftwood pushed up on the berm, and there are snakes intertwined in all of this pile of sticks. Manitoba actually has the largest population of snakes in the world. At the Narcissa snake dens, not too far from where we were, they overwinter in huge limestone cracks. And so without talking, we packed up all of our gear, and then we got to the water and realized we couldn't go anywhere. And so we just barely made it around the corner and set up camp a little bit further from the snake nests. On these windbound days, especially the stretch of 3 days in a row, the first day we were grateful to get rest. The second day, we were sort of frustrated that we couldn't leave. we couldn't continue on this journey. We felt like we urgently were being pulled towards Hudson Bay, and nature was telling us that, no, you can't paddle today, you can't go. And that doesn't often happen in life, where even during a snowstorm, you can't take your four-wheel drive and go get somewhere. So we were stuck on essentially this desert island, a very small beach next to a berm and nothing but swamp on the other side. And so that third day we woke up and we accepted our fate as being windbound and created art in the sand and started collecting rocks. And I tried to whittle a recorder out of a stick for 8 hours, and that definitely didn't work. But we just started having a really lovely time, which you might be able to relate to after this last year of having to slow down. I didn't take this picture. If you've ever taken a picture of the Northern Lights with a mediocre camera, it doesn't really work. But Anne and I were doing another night paddle, and the stars were out, the Milky Way was out, the lake was glass, and the stars were reflecting on the surface of the lake. So it looked like we were paddling through space. Anne and I got along really well for the majority of this trip. But our biggest problem was that Anne thought I was a little bit too carefree about things, and I thought Anne was a little bit too anxious about things and all the decisions that we had to make together as a team. This night I was in the stern, so I was controlling the direction of the boat. Anne felt like I pointed the boat a little bit too far from shore for her liking. And this one act basically made us tip. We started yelling at each other about all of our frustrations that had been pent up this entire trip and even before. But while we're yelling at each other, the Northern Lights start coming out above us. It started out as just a green glow and turned into these dancing strings of green and pink in the night sky. And I remember thinking, it was my first time seeing them, and I wanted so badly to say, Anne, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. But I wasn't talking to her. And so I didn't say anything. And the only thing that we said to each other that night was, I felt like we were getting too close to shore, since I perhaps was overcompensating. And so I asked Anne to take out her headlamp and shine it toward the trees. When she did, we saw the green light now in these two huge eyes of a bull moose, not 100 yards away from us. And she said, yep, we're too close to shore. We made up after that. We actually wrote each other handwritten letters while we were next to each other to explain how we felt. And that was that we were more sisters than friends, and it's okay to fight and have conflicts in your relationships that mean the most to you. It doesn't mean that your friendship is over. And looking back, it's much better that we fought instead of sort of repressed all of the challenges that we were facing as a team. This is an average day on Lake Winnipeg. In the North Basin, we paddled over a very large green carpet, toxic algal blooms caused by agricultural runoff on the Red River that you can actually see from space. So the same thing that happens, like I was talking about on the Minnesota River going to the Gulf of Mexico, happens the Red River moving into Lake Winnipeg. When we finally got to the end of Lake Winnipeg, Anne and I just bawled. We were so excited to be done with this section of our journey because in many ways it felt like the most dangerous part of our trip. We took the Nelson River to Norway House Cree First Nation, where we stayed with a Cree family called the Mushwagans. We got there just in time for an event called York Boat Days. Now, this event is where they race York boats, which you see here in this picture, large boats that the Hudson Bay Company used to use for their trading routes. And where we were headed, York Factory, is where they would manufacture these boats. At this event, really, it's something created by the government to celebrate the day that their land was flooded by Manitoba Hydro, and there are a lot of injustices within their history. And actually, this event, its sole purpose is to have the whole community line up and receive their annual $5 for compensation for generations of injustice. And so Anne and I, again, learned that when you take people away off of their land, when you strip them of their place and their community, you also take away their futures. We heard from Mike and his family about the struggles that they faced there. They, 85% of their community is on welfare. They have one grocery store that's outposted from Winnipeg. And so the money doesn't even flow back into their community. And things that have a lot of nutrients, milk and cheese, were so expensive. And so the community that used to live off of the land now is consuming a lot of processed foods and experiencing diabetes and different things like that. And so they're telling us these, stories about what it's like to live in Norway House. And they told us that they have a huge stray dog problem. And Anne and I had noticed that earlier as well. The dogs in the winter pack up and actually attack people. And so then Mike looks at us very seriously and he says, ladies, you're going into polar bear country. You should take a dog with you. And if a polar bear comes, it'll eat your dog and you'll have time to load your gun. Well, I'm 22, Anne's 21. We don't live anywhere. Getting a dog is a pretty big decision. We were a little bit concerned about going into polar bear country. And the next day we started looking around at the dogs, almost like we were window shopping all of a sudden. And we decided, you know what, we'll take a dog with us. So we were driving around that night with Mike's daughter, Crystal, looking for a dog about this size that we could, fit in the canoe. And we saw a dog licking ketchup packets off the ground outside of their movie theater. And I knew she was the one. And so I jumped out of the car and I grabbed her and I threw her in the back seat. And here she is, her first moments with us. This is Maihan. Mahihan in Cree means wolf. And the Mushwaugan family sort of blessed us with the name Maihan. We like to think that she was part wolf. We put her in the canoe the next morning to continue on the Nelson to the Hayes, and it turns out she's afraid of water. This actually worked out really well for a canoe dog. If you've ever tried to go paddling with a dog who loves water, they constantly try to jump out of the boat. Maihan was awesome at staying in the canoe all day, and then at night she would run around the woods. We finally had someone to blame all of those nighttime sounds on, when you're camping and you're about to fall asleep and then you hear the crack of a stick. You're like, it's probably a squirrel, but it also might be an axe murderer. Finally, we had someone to blame those nighttime sounds on. Maihan actually brought us one morning a beaver hand as sort of a welcome to the family gift. So I don't know the full backstory there. We finally got to the Hayes River, this Arctic, beautiful whitewater river that we could drink directly from. Paddling to Hudson Bay showed me that what we do on land greatly impacts the water. Water quality usually does not collapse overnight. It degrades slowly as a result of small compromises and seemingly harmless encroachments of industry and development sprinkled across a watershed. On this expedition, we witnessed the water change from, the polluted agricultural rivers where we had to fill jugs of water that would last us days to this beautiful Arctic river where we could just dip our cup into the river and drink straight from the water without filtering. The Hayes River is relatively untouched by humans. It has been used for a very long time by humans, but it is not constrained by human infrastructure. It effortlessly provided us with fresh water to drink and abundant fish to eat. It has room to breathe, to sink into the ground, and to expand into the landscape. And this river reminded us of what rivers once were, of what we've already lost in so many different areas, especially on the Minnesota River and on the Red River, and what could come back because rivers are resilient with new ways of living in and with the world. So we got to this whitewater section and playfulness returned to our relationship as we navigated the tricky twists and turns of the Hayes River. We had lots of stories here, which you can read about in my book, about almost going over a class 5 ledge, getting totally lost and ending up in this small island where 5 waterfalls ended. But I will move on because I know we don't have all the time in the world here, and I will read you a journal entry that I wrote when we arrived at York Factory. So just for reference, this is White Mud Falls that I reference in my journal entry. And these are the white mud cliffs that we started to see as we entered the taiga. So you go from the forest to the taiga, the trees get shorter and shorter and shorter, and then finally out into the tundra of near Hudson Bay. So I have a video that I'll show you, but first, before I read you my journal entry.
All right.
So this is a scene from the Echimamish River. Echimamish in Cree means river that flows both ways, and it did have a very confusing current at certain points. We kept coming across these beaver lodges and dams that would stretch the length of the river, and so we'd have to get out and pull our canoe over them and drag it over the top. So you can see here, Maihan at this time was actually only 6 months, we found out later. And she's much larger now. The mosquitoes on the trip were the worst during this section because, as you can see, it's sort of a swampy area. It's Maihan figuring out her new life as an outdoor dog. Here's one of our campsites.
It'll like widen to our campsite, but I don't know.
You can camp anywhere. We moved a fallen tree.
There she is, cooking away.
Welcome to the kitchen. And today we're making biscuits in the pot.
It started to get a little loopy.
What does the dog think of that?
Maihan, say hello to the GoPro. Yay!
And this is me.
It's J84. I don't know.
We really appreciated having Maihan along for our few portages. We would see fresh bear scat, and we knew that because Maihan was there and running the trail before us, that we would not take any wildlife by surprise. These portages, as you can imagine, are not well maintained, not used very often. And so Anne and I were carrying our canoe and 50, 60-pound packs through these trails. And you'll see here, we actually crossed a small crevice, a little canyon here across these old logs. And so it was fun to navigate those trails, and a lot of them were actually used by the Hudson Bay Company and used to have wooden tracks on them that they would pull the York boats. All right, so I'm going to read you this journal entry from the end of our trip. We ran several rapids until we reached White Mud Falls, our last set, portage, anything. I felt very emotional because I knew that after this portage, there was nothing that could stop us from making it to York Factory. The last few days brought emotional and physical challenges that left us exhausted and sore. After almost 3 months on trail, we were finally ready to end our trip. I felt a lack of nutrition had worn on my health. A dog at Norway House had eaten our entire bag of fresh food, and we didn't discover that until a day later. And so we were mostly eating varieties of Bisquick for 2 weeks. And I couldn't wait until I could eat fruits and vegetables again. While the hope of York Factory and relaxation was at our fingertips, we still had 200 kilometers to go on the river, and the rumors of polar bear country echoing in our minds. We paddled hard. Endurance and longevity are our strengths. We plan to make the 4-day trip from White Mud to York Factory in a mere 2 days. Our day lasted 15 hours before the sun made us retire to the shore. The moon did not show as we built our first fire to fight the cold. We planned to stay up all night, but after an hour, we felt the weight of our exhaustion and gave in to the comfort of our tent and sleeping bags. Ironically for Anne, it was one of her best nights of sleep, despite our anxiety in polar bear country. I slept, but I dreamt of creatures surrounding the tent and felt deep sorrow that we would never actually make it to the end. We left camp that morning without breakfast and continued on the flowing haze. We heard stories of a thick fog and dark clouds typical to this section of the river, but we had a clear morning. We approached the turn where the God's River joins the haze and saw our first woodland caribou swimming across the water. The current quickened at the conjunction, and we had a floating breakfast of cold quinoa and chili powder from the night before. We continued on our way. With 10 more hours of paddling ahead, we felt as far away from York Factory as we ever had. Our wrists ached, hands clenched, and minds, more than anything, were on the verge of insanity. The river was beautiful, though. There were high white mud cliffs on the right and low-lying spruces on the left, decorating the shoreline, always reminding us of our desolation. Our strokes slowed and stomachs turned, and we became desperate for the hours to pass. All of a sudden, from behind us, we heard a huge clap of thunder that spooked us both. Just then, a pack of wolves, 5 total, 1 black, came out to the riverbank from behind the spruce. The air was still. There was a suspicious calm. The wolves stopped in their tracks when they felt our presence. We stared, they stared. Myhan barked. A bird made a loud cry, and the sound brought goosebumps to our skin. We glanced at the dark cloud floating behind us, and we were off with the motivation, reminiscent of our efforts on the Red River. We reached the rock, a big rock on the riverbank that signified our remaining distance of 50 kilometers, 40 kilometers, 30 kilometers, 2 more hours. We sang every song we knew, including some Christmas medleys. We saw seals, caribou, a black bear. Every white rock looked as if it were swimming our way, and I joked that someone should spray paint them all black to soothe the nerves of canoeists on the haze. We were 10 kilometers away. We were hungry, tired, and desperate. It felt as though something could still go wrong, a storm or a bear. Could we really just arrive unscathed at York Factory? We passed the point where the tide effect would slow us down, but we were still moving steadily toward the bay. We turned left, and there it was, Hudson's Bay. Overwhelmed with hunger, we did not joyously celebrate the sight of the bay, but solemnly paddled toward it. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't quite know how to feel. These last few days have been some of the most trying days of my life, and I knew I could relax now, but I felt an emptiness as well. This has been my lifestyle for 85 days, and there was no party or trophy at the end, just a set of stairs leading up to a building that once manufactured York boats. How was this a major destination for canoeists? Who made the bay into a rite of passage? The history is interesting, and we were in awe at the expanse of water, but what made our voyage so significant and important to others? I do not yet understand the magnitude of our adventure and the importance of being the first 2 women to complete it. I'm sure I will reflect on these questions for years to come. So we made it to York Factory, and sorry, this photo's backwards. I had a manual camera with me and everything was inverted. We made it to York Factory, and I say in my journal entry, we were so hungry because we wanted to get there so badly that we didn't want to stop paddling to eat because that meant that we were delaying our arrival, which now for me is very hard to conceive that mindset. But we pull up and we climb this old rickety set of stairs up the eroded bank, and we just plop down and start making whatever food we have left, hash browns and beans, the most delicious meal I've ever had. And the caretaker comes up to greet us, and he's got a gun over his shoulder. And he's like, "Hey, ladies, it's a good thing you're here because the season is ending 2 weeks early and we're all heading out tomorrow." This would have been fine because we had a satellite phone and we would have just called our float plane to come pick us up. But as he was talking to us, a polar bear came around the corner and started meandering along the riverbank. We looked up at Liam, the caretaker, and said, we're ready to go inside. And so we were able to watch this polar bear in the wild through the window of the caretaker's house throughout the day. In 1930, when Eric Sevareid and Walter Port arrived here, it was a community of over 300 people. They actually went to church when they got here, and now it's a historic site that's maintained by 2 or 3 caretakers that you can only get to by float plane or boat. This white building is their sort of museum, and the bank that you see here now erodes 8 meters a year due to the melting permafrost and changing climate. Historical artifacts just pop out of that bank, and they place it in that building in no particular order. They've actually had to move that building 3 times now, because where it used to be now is where the river is in this picture. So that night we were able to stay in this little cabin you can see on the right over here, instead of camping along the shore while a polar bear was out and about. I woke up in the morning, Anne woke me up and she said, "Wake up, you have to see this." And I thought, we just paddled the Hudson Bay. I am exhausted. Can I sleep in for once? And she said, "No, you have to see this." And so we push out this hulky metal door. And as the sun is rising, we see the polar bear running across the boardwalk, the caretaker's German Shepherd chasing the polar bear, and the caretaker on an ATV chasing that with his gun. And they're all moving at the same speed across the landscape. And it was straight out of a Wes Anderson film or something. And I looked over at Anne and I said, "Okay, I think it's time we go home." We got to brand our paddles with the YF York Factory symbol that was used on the York Factory boats. The M on our paddles is for Minogen from our long trips in the Arctic. And then we took a 45-minute, $2,000 float plane ride to Gillam, Manitoba, and then a 35-hour train ride back to Winnipeg, where our friends picked us up at the train station. As we were loading their van, Anne remembered, the gun is still loaded. And I was like, well, empty that before we go across the border. And it's rush hour. People are in suits, carrying briefcases, moving about. And I look around and I just see Anne pumping a shotgun outside of the train station. And I remember thinking, I've been outside of society so long that I don't even know if this is normal anymore. But we got to the border station. We were nervous about crossing the border because we had picked up a dog, and we pass all of our passports over to our friend Megan, who hands them over to the border station agent. And she goes, "Well, what have y'all been doing?" And Megan goes, "These ladies just paddled the Hudson Bay." And the woman says, "No shit, go on ahead." And we're like, "We have a dog and a gun." She's like, "That sounds awesome." She also did her job well, but she was very excited for us, and crossing the border was less of an issue than we thought. So we drove to Anne's parents' cabin at the end of the Gunflint Trail and stayed there for 2 weeks, just sitting on her porch, looking out at a lake that once looked large and now looked much smaller. This expedition was a coming-of-age journey that became so much more than 2 strong women exploring the wilderness. The scars on the landscape unfolded before our eyes as we paddled north. The harm done by industry and agriculture and the injustices done to First Nation communities were impossible to ignore as we moved with the land and water. I can still feel those visceral moments of standing in a cornfield and being in a food desert, meeting farmers who could barely feed themselves, paddling over toxic algal blooms on Lake Winnipeg caused directly by agricultural runoff from the Red River, and watching a First Nation community line up to receive their annual $5 from the government as compensation for stolen land and generations of injustice. Those moments impacted how I perceive the world around me today. We were worried that living in a canoe for 3 months would be a huge gap in our resumes, when in fact, this expedition launched our careers and molded us into the women we are today. Paddling with the water opened our eyes to complex, interconnected relationships at play in and around us, and the importance of caring for the delicate balance of all life. Sometimes when I need reminding that It's okay to say yes to adventure. I read this poem by Robert Bly. What? You want to live your life over again? Well, I suppose, yes. That time in Grand Rapids, my life as I lived it was a series of shynesses. Being bolder, what good would that do? I'd open my door again. I've felt abashed, you see. Now I'd go out and say, all right, I'll go with you to Alaska. Just opening the door from inside would have altered me a little. I'm too shy. And so a bolder life is what you want? We could begin now. Just walk with me down to the river. I'll pretend this boat is my life. I'll climb in. You can get the book Hudson Bay Bound from Majors and Quinn if you want a signed copy and if you want to support local bookstores, but you can also get it anywhere on the interwebs. And there's much, much more to the story than you just heard here today. So I'd love for you to read that. And thank you so much for having me. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. There's one question in the chat right now. How many paddles broke and which kind were your favorite?
No paddles broke, and we had two different kinds of paddles. The long, skinny Langford paddles we enjoyed for upstream because they could just dig a little bit deeper. And then the shorter, wider paddles were much better for maneuvering whitewater and on a shallow, fast river. And bending branches paddles are my go-to.
So Natalie, I just looked it up and you presented to Rovers on July 2nd, 2013 last time.
Oh my God.
And I wondered how I missed it, but I happened to be in England at the time. So that's how I missed it.
Wow. Natalie, who got the dog or where's the dog?
Yeah, so Anne took my hun to Colorado. I just sort of trickled around for a while. So she actually had somewhere to live.
Okay.
And my hun is now 10 and has a degenerative disease and now is in a wheelchair. But you can follow my hun, the canoe dog, on Instagram, and is very enjoyable.
Who, you guys were on a budget or had no money, when you started. So who pitched in to feed the dog? What'd you do for dog food?
Yeah, so we actually picked up a bag of dog food at Norway House and portaged a massive bag of dog food.
All right. Okay.
And people, if you read the book, you'll read about all the things in the communities we went to. People always wanted to give us things. And so at the end, we had a whole portage bag of gifts from people and like a bottle of wine and
things
that you would never, ever take on a canoe trip.
Did you bring your canoes back, Natalie, or did you leave them?
Yeah, we brought our canoe back. It's actually in my garage in Minneapolis, but the wood is rotting out. So I need to find someone to help me sort of repair that. And that boat has also been down the Mississippi. So it's split North America in half.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And I see a question here, what Anne and I are doing now. Anne actually is just starting. Anne is an ecologist, climatologist, and works with statistics and computer modeling and climate change modeling. So she's working with NASA, but she's living in Colorado with her partner, Rachel, and they're getting married soon. And I am in Minneapolis since this trip. I did the other canoe expeditions that I've already talked about, but I've always centered rivers in my work. So I was guiding trips on the Minnesota River, doing watershed education. I was working on the St. Croix, doing land protection and environmental policy work, writing for Canoe and Kayak magazine. And now I'm in a PhD program at the University of Minnesota, studying environmental communication and writing about the human-nature relationship and sort of like ways of thinking ecologically and more sustainably. And that I'm writing and reflecting on my trip down the Mississippi River now.
You talked about the bending branches paddles. Were they any of them bent paddle, or it was all straight paddle?
All straight paddle at the time. I feel like bent paddle became a little bit more popular after that. And I personally don't enjoy sterning with a bent paddle. And we would switch bow and stern every day. But I do also now have bending branches paddles that are also great.
What kind of canoe?
We had a Langford Prospector. So Langford, it's a Kevlar, and Langford is a Canadian company. It's really whatever canoe we could get for free. If you really wanted to find, you can't find one boat that would be good for this entire trip because you're upstream, downstream, massive lake, whitewater river, right? Technically, you would take 4 different boats for that. But it worked out well in some sections, although not great in the wind.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do I need license tabs to go out in like a single person canoe? Because I'm just new into it. I'm thinking about going out.
Yeah, you do. I think it's anything above 13 feet.
Okay.
Or you through the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, you have to get a license for, and so that I believe now includes paddle boards too. Yes, the answer is yes. Although my sneaky answer is that you'd probably be fine, but you should get a license.
It's fairly inexpensive.
Thank you.
Yeah, they are, and they support water trails, so it's
How much are they?
Comes back. I think they're like under $20.
Oh, right on. Yeah. Cool.
Did you guys fish at all?
Yep, we did. We caught a lot of fish on the Hayes River until we accidentally left our fishing pole at one of our portages and realized 2 days later, which I still feel awful about. But yeah, the fish were abundant, very easy to catch, and really fun to fillet and cook up. I'm seeing some questions over here. There's a question about how we trained for it, and we were just young and athletic, and long trips are training for themselves in many ways. The muscle that we built on the Minnesota River helped us paddle the large waves in Lake Winnipeg, and so there wasn't a lot of intentional like paddling training, even though at this point we had already lived in a canoe for 100+ days in our previous trips. And Minogen prepared us for all the logistics planning and sort of knowing how to be on these larger expeditions. And then I see here why paddle upriver, and that was recreating the route set forth by Eric Sevareid and Canoeing with the Cree. They started at Fort Snelling State Park at Pike Island, which actually was underwater when we left. So we just found a random inlet to push out from. And then this question, what part of your trip was like Eric Sevareid's book? And we got lost in a lot of the same places, 80 years later. Marsh Lake, we were just so frustrated trying to find the Minnesota River again. And in the book, they had this same problem. And, in some ways, water management and the way that we use land has gotten better. Like they experienced a lot of cattle in the river. And that we did see one cow in the water, but it's not prevalent anymore, especially with issues of E. coli. And so agricultural practices have absolutely changed. And again, the Bois de Sioux River for them was not this sort of channelized human-made river. So there were a lot of different things. And they, of course, took a tow for the last half of Lake Winnipeg because they were windbound. So they hopped a ship. Lake Winnipeg was booming with a shipping industry and like tourist industry that was not around for us, partly due to the algal blooms that have really hit that industry hard.
Well, and they left a lot later, right? Didn't they leave on July 4th? And then they got delayed, and they ended up, by the time they got to the end of it, everything was freezing over.
It was October for them, and we got there August 25th, and it was pretty cold. So very, very, a month or two makes a huge difference up there.
Yeah.
Did you have to pack out all your garbage?
Yep.
Oh. That's a long trip with garbage.
Yeah, you'd be surprised with smart packing how little garbage you actually can create.
Yeah.
For meal planning, we carried a month of food at a time. And in the beginning, when we go through Fargo, we'll go to the grocery store and pick up more cheese. We actually had like a golden retriever ate 5 pounds of cheese once, and then a raccoon ate all of our cheese. So we had different hiccups with food things at different points. And then we shipped our last food segment to Norway House and picked it up when we got there. So we did have to do some planning ahead. Favorite piece of equipment. I'm not really a gearhead. I'm like, our boat floats, it's great. Like we got from point A to point B. So I'm trying to remember, honestly, it was this really shitty plastic coffee mug French press that we used the most. And we would make 2 a day and just sort of, it didn't live anywhere in the canoe. It would just sort of float about. And I'd say that was the most helpful, to have the combo of the coffee mug and the French press situation. Never used a piece of equipment would be our shotgun that we practiced firing in Inver Grove Heights, and the police showed up because there was gunfire, and we sort of hid from that situation. But we didn't have to use our gun, but when we were on the Hayes River on a lake, just sort of hanging out, we decided to put it together to make sure that, if we needed to get it out in an emergency, that we felt comfortable doing so. And so I put it together and I shot it across the lake, and 2 bald eagles flew out of a tree, and I have not shot a gun since then. So that was sort of a troubling experience for me. No, she didn't empty and I guess you just like pump out the shells. People who know guns might be better at answering this question. Like emptying the bullets out of a gun does not require firing the gun.
Did you have a favorite food on the trip, or?
We had a least favorite. We were sponsored by a granola bar company, and they had one flavor called lemon chamomile granola bars that we had rationed out, I think, to have every 6 days. And it was our least favorite day of the week. And that's what first comes to mind when you ask that question. Favorite food, I remember we had some chocolate ginger that really did the trick when we were slowing down, which was helpful. But we cooked all of our own meals. We didn't have any sort of pre-made dehydrated meals. So it was all like, we'd have dehydrated vegetables and pasta and cheese and salami, and we'd make different things that way.
What kind of a stove and fuel system?
Yeah, we had an MSR Whisper Light. I think we had 2 of them, and carried a fair amount of white gas with us on our trip for that. And we never cooked over a fire. On a trip like this, we were paddling 15 plus hours a day when the sunlight allowed. And so there's very little leisure time. And by the time you get to camp and set up, you're so tired that you just you cook and you go to bed and you do it all the next day. And so there was very little sort of romantic sitting by the fire type of situation for us. So we were always on the go. Is this trip possible for a vegan? Yeah, absolutely. Everything is possible for a vegan. There are some really creative trail meals now, especially like Camp Chow Foods. I know up off the Gunflint Trail has a lot of vegetarian, vegan meals. You might have to do a lot of dehydrating and sort of packing out on your own, but definitely possible.
So Natalie, what's the answer for the algae bloom?
Well, I have lots of feelings about our agricultural system, and you can trace back why it is the way it is, but I don't think we need to be growing I think the industrialization of agriculture is what is harming our water resources. And agriculture can be this really beautiful community-based thing where you grow food that directly feeds people. But what we're seeing now, especially with like fake meat and Beyond Burger and things like that, actually just further industrializes, I can't say that word, food. And so, but with that, there's a lack of concern for the interconnected systems that are at play there. All right, it is possible to feed everyone on the planet with the land that we have without directly polluting our water system. The corn that we grow going to ethanol, the corn that we grow going to feed cows that, again, need those pharmaceutical companies coming in, right? It's like this economic machine. And I think, there are some Band-Aid things that we can do, and people are working on the buffer zones and, filtering out chemicals from tiling flow and things like that. But I am just, living in an ideal future of we need to completely rethink our agricultural system and start thinking in systems so that we can see the importance of both food and feeding people and water quality, and how important clean water is to everything, healthy communities and it touches and trickles to everything.
Okay, any more questions to Natalie about her trip, or should we move on at this point?
This was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so very,
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Very nice. Yeah, okay. Excellent.
Thank you.